Hello YouTube. I'm a really big fan of the composer John Cage. He's really one of my heroes and he's had a lot of influence on me. But he's a very polarising figure. I think for many people he sort of represents modern art at its most empty and pretentious. His most controversial composition was 433, in which the performer does nothing. This is one version of the score. The word tacit there just means do nothing, basically. So, what was Cage up to here? I'd like to explain some of the ideas behind this piece, and if you have an open mind, I think there's quite a lot of interesting stuff going on here. 433 was composed in 1952, but I think the roots of it were planted around the 1930s. In the 1930s, Cage began exploring percussion, and he founded a percussion ensemble with the composer Lou Harrison, and it was working in percussion music that this heavily influenced Cage's ideas on music theory in general. And these are important, I think, to understanding 433. So, Cage's ideas on music theory. Well, the first point here is that there are four properties of sound that are relevant to music, and these are pitch, amplitude, timbre, and duration. Pitch is the frequency of a sound, whether it's high or low. So, ah is a low pitch, ah is a higher pitch. Pitch is what gives you melody when you have different pitches playing in succession, and harmony when you have more than one pitch playing simultaneously. Amplitude, of course, is just volume, whether it's loud or quiet. Timbre is the colour or the quality of a sound. Suppose you take a saxophone and an acoustic guitar and you play exactly the same note at exactly the same volume. The notes will still sound very different. One will have a kind of distinctive saxophone sound, the other will have a distinctive guitar sound. Timbre is what allows us to tell different instruments apart. Duration, of course, is just length, and this relates to time, beat, and rhythm. Now, sounds do have other properties. Sound waves have a direction and a speed, for instance, but these four properties are the ones that we're going to be interested in music. Now, Cage claimed that the entire tradition of Western music, since at least Beethoven, had operated on the assumption that pitch is the fundamental element of music. Now, I'm not entirely sure what it means to say that something is the fundamental element of music, but suffice it to say that Cage thought that most Western musicians were far more concerned about pitch than anything else. I don't really know enough about music history to say whether this is true, but it does strike me as quite plausible. Most classical music, especially since before the 20th century, does seem to be highly focused on pitch and harmony and melody. Now, for Cage, there was a really big problem here, because if you say that pitch is the most important, then some instruments and many kinds of sound will be relegated to a secondary place. A purely percussive instrument is never going to be as important as a piano or a bassoon or a cello. As I said, Cage was involved in a percussion ensemble. He founded this percussion ensemble, so obviously he wanted to resist this. He felt that this kind of view was elitist and restrictive. He wanted to show that percussive sounds can be just as important. So he argued that the fundamental element of music is not pitch, but duration, rhythm and time. Here's a quote from Cage around the 1940s. He says, "If you consider that sound is characterised by its pitch, its loudness, its timbre and its duration, and that silence, which is the opposite and therefore necessary partner of sound, is characterised only by its duration, you will be drawn to the conclusion that of the four characteristics of the material of music, duration, that is time length, is the most fundamental. Silence cannot be heard in terms of pitch or harmony. It is heard in terms of time length." Silence is an essential part of music. One thing that all musicians are taught is that rests, where the performer plays nothing, can be just as important as sounds. But rests can only exist as durations. They have no pitch, no amplitude, no timbre. They're just lengths of time. So duration is the only property that all the elements of music share, and hence it's duration that's fundamental. Now, the upshot is that when it comes to composing music, it doesn't really matter what kind of sounds you have. As long as you have the temporal divisions, you can put anything in them, conventional musical sounds or noises or silence. On Cage's view of music, all these things are equal. No sound, or even a lack of sound, is more essentially musical than anything else. Any sounds, even no sounds, can be music. For Cage, there's no distinction between a conventional musical instrument like a cello and anything else you might use to produce music, like a bunch of cheap tin cans. So here we have one of the important ideas of 433. 433 emphasises the importance of duration, because the only thing the performer can do in a performance of this piece is signal the duration. That's all the performer is allowed to do. And this draws attention to what Cage takes to be the fundamental element of music, because it just strips away everything else. If you accept that 433 is a piece of music, then evidently neither pitch nor amplitude nor timbre can be fundamental to music. Only duration can be, because that's the only thing that we have with 433. So this now brings us to another important point. One of the things I was talking about there was rests and silence. When the performer plays nothing, they are silent. But what is silence? Well, Cage came to realise that there was a problem equating rests with silence. The story goes that in the 1950s, Cage visited an anechoic chamber at some university. An anechoic chamber is a room that's designed to cut off all noise from the outside. So as long as you're not making any noise, it should be completely silent. But when Cage went in there, he heard two noises, a low pitch and a high pitch. The low pitch was his cardiovascular system rumbling away, and the high pitch was thought by Cage to be his nervous system operating, although it was actually probably just mild tinnitus. But anyway, I mean, whatever those sounds were, they had a big impact on him, because he realised that silence, at least if we understand silence to mean the absence of sound, silence is completely impossible. There will always be sounds. Now here's what Cage said about the original audience's reaction to 433. The original audience assumed that 433 was a silent piece. Okay, Cage said, "They missed the point. There's no such thing as silence. What they thought was silence, because they didn't know how to listen, was full of accidental sounds. You could hear the wind stirring outside during the first movement. During the second, raindrops began pattering the roof. And during the third, the people themselves made all kinds of interesting sounds as they talked or walked out." When we talk about silence, we're really referring to sounds that we don't notice, because sound is always going on all around you. As long as you have functioning ears, at least, you'll never be without sound. 433 encourages us to turn our attention towards the sounds we usually ignore. It's not a silent piece. The piece consists of all the sounds that happen to occur during its performance. If it starts raining and that makes a sound on the roof, that's part of 433. If somebody coughs, that's part of 433. If a dog barks in the distance, that's part of 433. These are the sounds that we would usually ignore, or that we'd even consider distractions. But in 433, these are the content of the piece. Now, something quite radical follows from this point. If we see 433 as consisting just of silence, then there's a very straightforward sense in which Cage is the composer. So we can say, okay, Cage specified a particular amount of silence. So that's composition. There's not much involved in that, but it's that is an act of composition. So, but as I said, 433 isn't silence. It consists of whatever sounds happen to occur during its performance. So, in what sense is Cage the composer of this piece? All the sounds that occur during it are totally outside of his control. So I think it's worth considering, what did Cage think the role of the composer should be? Okay, in what sense has he composed something here? Okay, well, to answer this question, we need to take a step back. In the 1940s, Cage had entered a deep personal crisis. His relationship with his wife was falling apart because he found himself increasingly attracted to the dancer Merce Cunningham, who was a man. So not only has he got this divorce going on, he was also a gay man in 1940s America, which presumably wasn't the easiest place to be gay. He was depressed, confused, frustrated, and he tried to express these feelings in his music, as composers often do. So he wrote a piece called The Perilous Night. And to Cage, this was an intense and sad composition. He wrote that it expresses the loneliness and terror that comes to one when love becomes unhappy. So, pretty dark stuff, but unfortunately nobody else heard it that way. All the critics seemed to think it was a bit light-hearted, maybe even a joke. And this was a serious artistic blow to Cage. He'd always assumed that the function of music was communication. Composers write music to express their feelings. But Cage was having these very strong feelings. He was pouring them into his music, and nobody was getting it. So he realised that music couldn't possibly serve this function of communication. It's far too open to individual interpretation. What sounds desperately sad to one person can be light-hearted and jolly to another. But if music isn't about communication, what exactly is its function? Well, in the mid-40s, Cage met an Indian musician called Geeta Sarabhai, and they agreed to teach each other music. He would teach her Western music, she would teach him Indian music. Now, Sarabhai's teacher had a motto which she told to Cage, and it had an enormous influence on him. The motto is, "The purpose of music is to sober and quiet the mind, thus rendering it susceptible to divine influences." So what does this mean? Well, divine influences sounds fairly religious, but Cage favoured a secular interpretation. Cage wrote that divine influences are all the things that happen in creation. There's nothing that isn't. For Cage, divine influences are just everything that's happening all the time, all around you. This is a very sort of Zen-like point of view, and we'll come back to Zen again later, but just flagging that up there. So anyway, the point of music is to make you accepting of all the sounds that occur all around you every day. The sound of traffic, the sound of factories, the sound of roadworks, the hum of the computer. The purpose of music is to make you accepting of all of these. Now note that sobering and quieting the mind isn't about becoming calm or mellow or anything like that. Rather, it's about removing preconceptions. It's about making you non-judgmental of everything you encounter. All the sounds that occur in daily life can be sources of great pleasure. And the function of music is to make us realise this. It's to make us realise that if we just open our minds to all the different sounds, they can bring us great pleasure, even something like the hum of a computer. So this is a view of music that's totally antithetical to communication or expression. Indeed, the composer should actively work to eliminate emotional expression from his compositions. This is because the composer has a higher purpose, helping the audience become susceptible to the sounds of life. There was another motto that Cage really loved from Ananda Kumaraswamy, which is that the purpose of art is to imitate the operation of nature. Obviously, there's no room in natural processes for communication or expression. The wind whistling through the trees and the waves crashing on the shore, that doesn't express anything. Cage later said of his work from around this time, he said, "I wanted my work to be free of my own likes and dislikes, because I think music should be free of the feelings and ideas of the composer." Cage wants to remove his own voice and his own emotions from his music. And this led to one of his most famous innovations, the use of chance operations in composing. So instead of deciding himself what note to write, he would flip coins to choose. They would he'd flip some coins and they would determine the pitch, the amplitude, and so on. That's one way of eliminating his own input. But 433 takes this idea to its ultimate extreme. In this piece, Cage totally relinquishes control. He has nothing whatsoever to do with the sounds that you'll hear during the performance. It's just ambient noise. These are sounds that would have occurred anyway, whether or not 433 had been performed. So clearly Cage has nothing to do with them. It's worth bearing in mind that there are different versions of 433. The first couple of versions specify the length of the piece. So many people think that 433 is 4 minutes 33 seconds, and that's totally true of the first versions. But Cage became unsatisfied with these versions and eventually settled on this, the tacit version that we saw earlier. In this version, Cage doesn't specify the durations anymore. He leaves it up to the performer to decide how long the piece will be. You could have it going for a minute, an hour, a day, a lifetime. I think this is the best version. It best encapsulates the idea of removing the voice of the composer. In a performance of 433, Cage has nothing to do with the finished product. He has no control over the sounds that are produced, nor even any control over how long it goes on for. So this all leads to a question. What exactly has Cage composed here? What is 433? If he's removed himself from the sounds, what is his contribution? Well, I think that 433 is essentially an exemplification of Cage's general theory of art. So, what is art? Well, art encompasses many things. Guernica, fountain, Joe's garage, bird in space, ancient drawings on cave walls, Hamlet, street graffiti. What is it that makes all of these things art? That's a fundamental question in aesthetics. Well, Cage's answer was simple, and he illustrated it with a story about an argument he once had with the painter Willem de Kooning. Cage and de Kooning were at a restaurant debating the nature of art, and de Kooning felt that Cage's attitude to art was too liberal. Cage was happy to consider almost anything to be art, but Kooning felt that we need strict standards. So de Kooning made his fingers into a square shape and held them over some breadcrumbs on the table, and said, "Look, just because you put a frame around some breadcrumbs, that doesn't make them art." Well, Cage disagreed. He felt that even a few breadcrumbs on a restaurant table can be art. According to Cage, all it takes for something to be art is for us to put an aesthetic frame around it. With paintings, we literally put a frame around them. With other kinds of art, the frame is metaphorical. Art isn't a property that's intrinsic to the object. We decide what counts as art. Something becomes art just in case we take a special kind of aesthetic attitude towards it, just in case we interpret it in an aesthetic way. Splotches of paint on a canvas become a painting. They become a piece of visual art when you put a frame around them. Similarly, a bunch of sounds become music when you mentally frame them as music. With this in mind, we can see exactly what 433 is. 433 is simply a frame for whatever sounds occur during its performance. Anybody can perform it. Cage is inviting you to start framing any sounds you hear, at any time, in an aesthetic way. Okay, so we've covered sort of four basic ideas here. First of all, we've seen that for Cage, the fundamental element of music is not pitch, but duration. Second, there's no such thing as silence. Third, the composer should aim to make the audience accepting of all sounds and should not allow his own emotions to influence the music. And fourth, all it takes for something to be art is that you mentally frame it in an aesthetic way. So these four ideas are all big influences on 433. But there's one important piece of the puzzle that I haven't dealt with yet, and that's Zen. Cage first started learning about Zen Buddhism in the late 40s, and he was taught by D.T. Suzuki, and it had an enormous influence on him. Now, my own impression is that by the time Cage became involved in Zen, the sort of ground for 433 had already been laid. But I think that Zen brought all his ideas together in one place, and it provided a justification for them. So, one of the main parts of Zen involves achieving a kind of direct, non-conceptual, non-judgmental focus on the present moment. It involves quieting the activity of the mind and just attending to feelings and events and experiences as they transpire. Don't try to hold on to them, don't wish them away, just let them be, accept them for what they are. Remember that from the point of view of Buddhism, if you've ever read anything about Buddhism, and this includes Zen, you'll probably know that for Buddhists, the ultimate source of suffering and dissatisfaction is desire. We desire for things to be other than how they are. We want that shiny new TV. We want a better microwave. We want more time to listen to music. Or more seriously, let's say you have some degenerative vision disease. You're losing your sight, but you desperately want to keep your sight. Well, we can never satisfy all our desires, and unsatisfied desires produce suffering. So an essential part of Zen is, instead of wanting to shape the world to match your desires, you simply become accepting of the world as it is. This is what we mean by non-judgmental focus on the present. It involves overcoming your desires, overcoming your value judgments, overcoming your likes and dislikes. To say that this thing is good and this is bad, we're elevating some parts of the world and rejecting others, rather than simply receiving it with an open mind, receiving whatever experiences happen to pass. Here's what Cage has to say about this. He says, "The value judgment, when it is made, doesn't exist outside the mind, but exists within the mind that makes it. When it says, this is good and that is not good, it's a decision to eliminate from experience certain things. Suzuki said that Zen wants us to diminish that kind of activity of the ego and to increase the activity that accepts the rest of creation. Value judgments are the source of suffering, and value judgments muddy our experience of the world." It should be obvious why Cage found this idea appealing. This provides a beautiful justification for his view that the composer should not try to express his own voice or emotions. Art should be free of the likes and dislikes of the artist. For Cage, I think that composition almost took the role of a sort of... It became for him a kind of meditative thing. When he was composing, he was just accepting whatever sounds would result. So this for him was sort of a Zen meditation type thing. Another very important aspect of Zen is its emphasis on overcoming dualistic thinking. I should note, by the way, that I'm no expert on Zen, but the basic idea as I understand it is this. When we approach the world rationally and intellectually, we divide it up into discrete categories, usually involving binary oppositions. So dark, light, man, woman, work, leisure, mind, body, rational, emotional, love, hate, self, others, life, death, good, evil, and so on. But again, when we do this, we're dividing up the world. We're excluding the parts that don't fit neatly into our categories. We're prioritising particular parts of experience over others. So, as well as achieving non-judgmental focus, Zen also emphasises non-conceptual focus. Break down the concepts, dissolve the dualities, focus on spontaneous unmediated experience. 433 is all about dissolving dualities, and we've already seen a couple of this. It dissolves the distinction between essentially musical sounds and other sounds. Okay, all sounds can be part of music. Then it dissolves the distinction between sound and silence. Now, these are fairly abstract ideas, but 433 also dissolves more practical sort of dualities, and there are a couple of examples here. So first of all, notice that whenever we listen to a piece of music, we impose a duality on the sounds we hear. There's the music itself, the composition itself, and then there are the other sounds. A car driving by, a dog barking, the wind blowing, and we attend to the former and try to ignore the latter. We attend to the music and try to ignore the other sounds. We do this even with other pieces by John Cage. So consider a recording of Cage's Etudes Australes, where lots of coughing from the audience is audible. Well, many people would probably find that detracts from the recording. Okay, it's a distraction. They just want to hear the etudes itself. But we simply can't impose this duality onto 433 because the other sounds are all there is to it. 433 totally erodes the distinction between music and not music. With 433, we see that the coughing, or the sound of the dog barking, or the sound of the car, is not really an intrusion. We attend to this sound and appreciate it on its own terms, just as we can for any other sound. Second, 433 can be performed anywhere, anytime, by anyone. You don't have to go to a theatre to hear it, you can perform it right now. Just turn your attention to the sounds occurring all around you. And notice that even if you do go to a theatre and they present a performance of 433, this doesn't mean you'll actually hear 433. So imagine somebody going to a performance of 433 and they try to attend to the silence. So, when somebody in the audience coughs or when the car drives by outside, this listener considers that a distraction. I think it's fair to say that this person has simply failed to experience 433. The point here is that To hear 433, to experience 433, you have to put in the work. You have to apply the aesthetic frame to the ambient noise all around you. If you haven't done that, you simply haven't heard 433. So this piece erodes another duality, the duality between the performer and the audience. I can't perform 433 for you, you have to do it yourself. Beyond the way that 433 makes these points, I think it very much exemplifies a kind of Zen attitude. It has a directness and simplicity, but it's also playful and somewhat confounding. The natural reaction to it is something like, how is that music? They're not even playing anything. But where the ultimate goal of confounding you is to provoke a change in your attitudes and to help you see the world in a new light. If you've ever read any Zen, you'll probably recognise these characteristics. In particular, Zen koans are short stories or sayings that are used in the teaching of Zen. They tend to be very simple and direct, but also paradoxical in a playful, impish sort of way. They try to confuse the rational mind in order to force a change in your worldview. The most famous Zen koan is, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" I'm sure you've all heard that one before. That's a real koan. It's by somebody called Hakuin Ekaku. So, what is the sound of an instrument without a player? So that's 433. I just want to finish with some advice. I think that understanding the ideas behind Cage's music can help you to appreciate it. I hope that you've come to appreciate 433 a bit more from watching this. But when listening to Cage's music, it's important not to have too much concern for the ideas that motivated him. The situation is one where, as Wittgenstein would say, you have to throw away the ladder after you've climbed it. Because for Cage, what's important are the sounds and the sounds alone. His music isn't about ideas, it's simply about sounds. Look at this from the point of view of Zen. The moment we ask about the meaning or the intention or the idea behind a sound, we inevitably put a limit on our experience. We set up a test that some sounds might fail. We're implying that if this sound doesn't have a meaning, then it's lesser in some way. So to be concerned about meanings and ideas is to judge things only in relation to our own preconceptions. Well, John Cage invites us simply to listen to the sounds. When the rain pattered down during that first performance of 433, it wasn't saying anything about silence or Zen or the nature of art. It didn't mean anything. And that didn't matter, because the sound was beautiful. To quote John Cage, he says, "When I talk about music, it finally comes to people's minds that I'm talking about sound, that doesn't mean anything, that is not inner but is just outer. And they say, 'You mean it's just sounds?' Thinking that for something to just be a sound is for it to be useless. Whereas I love sounds, just as they are." I hope you found this discussion informative, but ultimately 433 doesn't mean anything at all. And that's Zen for you. Goodbye.